Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today. My name is Chris Eddy. I'm the Realtor and General Manager of Community Insurance Agency in Coon Rapids. Together with People's Company of Clive, we're pleased to bring you several high-quality tracts of farmland owned by the Garst family of Coon Rapids. Representing People's Company today are Steve Brewer, President, and Matt Adams, Realtor and top producer. They're both on the call with us today. As you all know, and the reason why you're here is there's a first of its kind conservation easement that'll be placed on all of the farms with the intention of preserving existing erosion control structures and enhancing soil health on all of the tracts. Today's focus will be to offer some insight about the conservation easement, to answer some of your questions, and to introduce the individuals that have been associated with creating the easement or will be involved in the monitoring of the easement. This is the first of 3 planned webinars. The others will be held on August 5th. And for those selected to the live bidding portion of the sale, there will be a final webinar on August 13th. Before we start the meeting, there's a few housekeeping items here. All attendees have been muted. We'll accept questions in the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen. We'll do that at the end of the meeting. The meeting is going to be recorded and it will also be posted on YouTube following the conclusion of the meeting. I imagine you can search Garst Farms Auction Conservation Webinar and the YouTube video will pop up. Questions that are not answered during this meeting will be addressed within the next 2 days and we'll post the responses on the auction website. So if you don't get your question answered, don't feel like you're left out. We'll get to it and make sure that those answers are there for everyone to see. You can submit questions after the meeting to me at my email address is chris.eddy@commons.net. So chris.eddy@commins.net, or you can submit them to molly@peoplescompany.com. That's MOLLI@peoplescompany.com. Our first presenter of the day is Dr. David Muth. David is the managing partner for Alternative Equity Advisors out of Clive, an affiliate of People's Company. One of the many things they focus on is to help landowners use farm data to maximize profit on every acre of the farm. David grew up on a family farm in north central Iowa and understands the economics of farming. He's trained as a mechanical engineer and received his PhD from Iowa State University. David will discuss conservation techniques that have been utilized on the farms that are being offered for sale, and will document why these techniques can be profitable for future owners. Please take it away, David.
Thank you much, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. This is kind of a fun thing to be a part of, right? We've got a pretty unique and potentially really impactful process that we're working through here, and it's been pretty exciting to see it come together and be involved in the process. So what I wanted to do a little bit is talk about the practices that are being considered in the easement as it pertains to the asset performance and kind of the things we're seeing in the marketplace on creating some real value going forward. So when we think about the no-till practices, the control structures, the whole suite of conservation practices that have been implemented over a long period of time and well documented that are all considered and carried forward in the easement, there's a few things that we're trying to work towards. First and foremost, we want to improve top-end production potential, right? This is clear. This is the conversation. It's the target of everything that we're trying to do in production agriculture. There's a flip side to that where we want to increase some resiliency when we run into these higher stress types of scenarios and create some buffers within the system that can help us deal with that. Certainly reduction of in-field variability. That is a really challenging thing from a long-term profitability and a efficiency of how we use our working capital kind of perspective when we're talking about production ag. Then we're also seeing a number of pressures coming from the supply chain where we're trying to sell our products. And this is actually setting up for success in a lot of ways in that context. So let's step into this and just look at some information right off of particularly the Audubon County assets that are part of the auction. And there's always a few challenges when you're looking at one data point among many in production ag. So what we're doing here is we're comparing these specific assets on yield, corn and soybean historically, against the county average, right? And I think we all recognize that there can be very specific weather events that, say, a hail event or a really, really high rainfall event that can impact a particular asset, and less so the aggregate of data that come across the whole county. But we see some really interesting things jump out right away. So on the top two graphs, what we've got here is corn yield on the left and soybean yields on the right for this Bonnie Clover tract. And there's a couple of things that we take away right off the bat. The trend line going back to 2000 in both cases is accelerating at a faster pace than what we see for the county average. This is a perfect case study for these kinds of practices building the outcomes that we want. We also see that top end potential piece where we are seeing higher yields in certain years versus where we get the county average to pop out. And we also see in some of these higher stress scenarios, 2012 is a great example where we're just a little bit more resilient against some of those pressures. When we move to the bottom two graphs, a similar outcome in terms of the pace of growth on the trend lines. We're seeing corn yields improve, and we've got a really extensive data set here going back to 2000 to be able to look and compare on this. We see that corn growing a little bit faster. This is pretty common, right? When we start to talk about soil health outcomes and implementing these practices, you see responses a little bit more quickly in corn than what you do in soybeans. But we generally see a lot of these same characteristics that we're chasing, that top end potential, that growth over time, and some resiliency when we have higher stress scenarios. Really a sort of beautiful data set representing some of these outcomes. Here's an example. This is a vegetative index image that shows the intensity of the vegetation, the thickness of the vegetation, taken fairly recently. And what we see is a lot of consistency across the farm. You certainly can see some of the conservation structures out there. The waterways and terraces will jump out as a different color, but the crop acres are very consistent. This is a major positive in terms of driving profitability going forward. And it's one of those key things that we look at. But the last thing I wanted to hit on really quick is thinking about this conservation easement as it relates to things coming at us in the marketplace. The reality right now is consumers are demanding more transparency and certain characteristics when it plays into sustainability for their food products. And that's driving through the supply chain. And folks like General Mills, they're already in their corporate sustainability report commitment of 100% of their top 10 ingredients being quote unquote sustainable by 2020. And the reality is that all of these products that we're selling are fitting into this mix, right? That picture in the lower left, those are all the brands, the food product brands that we buy in the grocery store, convenience store, et cetera. They're really controlled by 10 companies globally. And all of these companies have these corporate sustainability initiatives. And what we see is over time, we're going to have sort of a barrier to entry on our products getting into the marketplace, even in our high throughput commodities, where we're going to have to prove a certain level of stewardship and sustainability. We're engaged in a standard called Leading Harvest that certainly is one of the mechanisms by which we can show that sustainability and gain that access. But the practices that have been used historically, the practices considered in the easement moving forward, create a really interesting opportunity to be at the front of the line in the marketplace when we start to look at some of these pressures continuing to come down. So I just wanted to give a little bit of perspective on how we think about these practices around the asset, that asset focus. And I want to turn it over for other folks to start working through some of the specific questions, some of the specific outcomes that are going to pop up here.
Very good. Thank you, David. Our next presenter will be Paul Morf, an attorney with Simmons, Perrine, Moyer, and Bergman out of Cedar Rapids. Paul is the author of the conservation easement. He graduated law school in 1997 and joined the law firm in 1998. He has extensive experience in wills, trusts, estate planning, and also serves as legal counsel for nonprofit entities. He's a current board member for the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation and a past board member of the Iowa Trust for Land Conservation. Please take it away, Paul.
Thank you very much. So my job is just to give a thumbnail sketch of these easements and what they are as a legal matter and what's permitted and what's prohibited and what happens, I guess, if there's a dispute. And then we'll have some time for questions later. So a conservation easement is an interest in property, and it's an interest in property that's created by state law. It's Iowa Code Chapter 457A of the Iowa Code authorizes an easement to be created and to be perpetual or to last forever and run with the land for certain purposes. And those purposes including protecting agricultural land, promoting soil and water conservation, protecting open space, and in general, conserving natural resources. And that is what these easements on all 8 parcels will do. And they're almost identical. They have some small variations that have to do with some properties that are unique to each of the different parcels. For example, there's a couple parcels that share a terrace. And so we have to deal with each landowner's rights and obligations with respect to maintaining that terrace on a boundary. But for the most part, these are very similar, and I'm going to talk about them as a group. And so a conservation easement is going to be gifted to White Rock Conservancy, which is a nonprofit organization very involved in sustainable agricultural and natural resource conservation in Iowa, based in Coon Rapids, founded by the Garst family. And the White Rock Conservancy will own this conservation easement before closing. And the conservation easement will actually be gifted by the seller, by the Garst Supply Company or Bonnie Land, depending on the parcel. And the buyer will take subject to that recorded easement. But the purchase agreement that will be signed on the day of the auction by the buyer will include a provision that says they agree, they've had a chance to review the terms of the easement, and they agree that they take subject to that easement. So that's how it will work. And the easement is a legal document. We're still assembling the exhibits, but you'll have plenty of time to review all of the fine print, and you can ask questions. And if there are things that don't make sense, you can talk to us about that. But basically, it allows White Rock to enter the property, to monitor, to do some testing. And if they determine that there's a violation of the terms of the easement, they have certain enforcement rights. Now, this is drafted to try to avoid going to court. The first enforcement right is to talk to the landowner and see if you can work out an agreement. Maybe there's a legitimate disagreement and that there's not actually a violation and just a misunderstanding. Maybe it's a gray area. If it's a gray area, the parties are supposed to work with the NRCS or a university expert to try to determine informally, without going to court, what the right answer is. But if, for example, one of the requirements is a cover crop be planted every year, if the landowner just isn't planting cover crops, just thumbing its nose at that requirement of the easement, White Rock does eventually have the right to give 30-day notice to cure. If it can't be cured or there's no cure, then they have the right to go to court, and the court will enforce this easement. And if a violation is found, the attorney's fees will be paid by the party that's found to be in the wrong. So that's the worst case scenario. Luckily, the restrictions of this easement are not very many and not very onerous. So essentially, the only things you cannot do with the property are the things that are expressly prohibited in paragraph 4. But before we get to paragraph 4, which is what's prohibited, we talk about things that are expressly permitted, so safe harbors. So all agricultural practices are permitted as long as you meet the requirements for agricultural production. So row crops, forestry, permaculture, hay production, grazing, aquaculture, participation in CRP and other government programs, completely permitted with certain requirements that are related to soil and water quality and health and conservation. And so we'll go into those. But as long as you meet those requirements, you can do any agricultural practice. Also, within certain building envelopes, you can build any structure you want. You can build ag structures, you could build a mall, doesn't matter. And each property will have at least one 15-acre rectangular building envelope. And the larger properties, the properties in Audubon County, 2 of them will be allowed 3 building envelopes, and the Nix Reds property will be allowed 2 building envelopes. And after the auction concludes, the winning bidder will get to say, here's where I want that envelope. So you get to pick where it goes. But then the easement will be recorded, and that will be locked in. Now, there is an amendment mechanism. It's possible in the future that there could be an amendment if there was a reason to move that building envelope. That would be up to White Rock, and it'd have to be shown that on balance, moving that building envelope doesn't diminish the soil and water conservation values of the property. But in that envelope, you can do essentially anything. And then it can also be sold, transferred, subdivided. There is a fee of $2,000 related to each subsequent transfer, and that is just to defray the costs that White Rock will have in changing its practices because of that transfer. And if it's a subdivision, so if the buyer, if it's owned by an LLC or a group of people, and then they later decide we're going to parcel it out and have different people own different parts of this one tract that's being auctioned off as a whole, that will require more monitoring because each of those owners is going to have separate monitoring. It will make more cost for White Rock. And so the subdivision fee, each time a parcel is divided into multiple parcels so that there are new owners of each, is $20,000. But within those limits, you can divide it, you can transfer it without restriction. And then the last paragraph says you can do anything else at all on the property, as long as it doesn't interfere materially with the conservation values of the land, which has to do with soil health. And there's a lot of measures, a lot of data that will be used to support that. So we tried to not prohibit anything that we didn't need to prohibit to protect the soil health. What is prohibited are certain farm practices that the sellers have determined are counter to their view of what produces augmented and continuously improving soil health. And those things are very few, but the first is tillage. So the winning bidder and all future owners of these properties will have to no-till this. Now, there are some exceptions in here. If you're repairing or expanding tile, you can till up the soil for those purposes, but you have certain obligations to restore it. You can obviously go in and fix or improve erosion control structures. There are times when you need to tear up the soil, but as a general matter, this is not going to be subject to tillage agriculture. The second one is that there are restrictions on Cafos, confined animal feeding operations. Now, within the building envelope, you can still build whatever buildings you want for agriculture to house hogs or chickens or cows, but the density cannot exceed 1 animal unit per 1.5 acres per year. And those numbers are based on Iowa DNR manure management plan specifications, which are available. But it's basically 1 cow, it is a standard animal unit, and chickens and pigs are factors based on that. And we have all of that data, and there's a link to the DNR materials right in the conservation easement. And also the winning bidder and all subsequent owners will have to maintain or enhance the erosion control structures. It's not that changes can't be made, but White Rock would have to be satisfied that the changes being requested are consistent with the soil conservation that's represented by the current structures. It couldn't make it lesser. It could have to at least make it as good as it is now. And there's some details in that. So, and then the last thing, major thing, is that you have to have continuous living roots. And so if it's in hay crop, that obviously is not a big deal. But if it's in corn or beans or other row crop agriculture, what that translates to is that you have to have a cover crop on during the dormant period. And there's some detail on that. There's a lot of flexibility as best practices change. You're not locked into particular things, but you should read that and understand it before you bid. And there's a lot of flexibility for changes to be made or deviations to be permitted if there are acts of God or floods or conditions that don't make it practical to actually get a cover crop in the ground in the normal period of time, the white rock is required to kind of quickly deal with that and to not hold a landowner accountable for something that was not their fault, that couldn't be prevented. But it's a very serious requirement that absent acts of God and so forth, cover crops will be put on immediately following harvest and will not be killed until right before planting. Mining that would be inconsistent with the soil quality is also prohibited. So those are the main things: no-till, cover crops, maintain the conservation structures like terraces and grass waterways, and if all of those things are done, you can farm however you want. So I encourage you all to read the entire easement, which will be available in the portal, and if you have questions or if there are things that don't make sense, submit a question and we'll get you an answer, just so everybody understands it and there's no surprises. That's it on my end, I think.
Very good. Thank you, Paul. As Paul discussed too, the easements for each individual tract, the draft easements, have been posted in the data room under each farm. As the exhibits are added and the full easement is assembled, those documents are updated. So if you've looked at that in the past, please continue to check it for updates and changes to make sure you're looking at the current version. So our next presenter here, the organization that's been selected and referenced here several times is White Rock Conservancy at Coon Rapids. White Rock is a 5,500 acre nonprofit land trust created in 2004 by the Garst family. White Rock's mission is to improve the condition of conservation land through appropriate land management, demonstrate sustainable farming methods, and provide educational and recreational opportunities for visitors. Easement monitoring will be the responsibility of the land manager, Carissa Shoemaker, and longtime farm manager, Darwin Pierce. Carissa will present for White Rock today. Please go ahead, Carissa.
Hi all. As Chris mentioned, I'm Carissa, White Rock's new land manager. I started in April. And as he also mentioned, we have a long-standing farm manager and others on property who have a ton of experience in farming. So we feel very excited and prepared to take on these easements. As Paul kind of delved into, our role in the easement is to periodically visit these properties and ensure that the provisions are being met, to collect data and to provide support to landowners and farm managers. To get to know White Rock a little bit better, as Chris mentioned, we're a 5,500 acre nonprofit. We have around 40 miles of trails, about 3,700 acres of native habitat, 1,000 acres of pasture and hay ground, and then about 800 acres of row crop. So again, the easements are a natural extension of our mission, that three-pronged mission Chris mentioned, and then also our expertise. Within agriculture, we've been no-till since the 80s, as this land was largely owned by the Garst before it became White Rock. And we've been experimenting with cover crops since 2008 with almost full adoption in 2013. We have cover crop on all but one farm, which is enrolled in a prairie strips trial with Iowa State University. And we also continue to maintain a bunch of erosion control structures, including terraces, waterways, contour buffer strips, and more, which you can see on all of the Garst farmland. We also are continuing a long history of agricultural innovation on this landscape, and we do not shy away from experimentation. So that's another thing that we're excited about in terms of these easements, because they're really innovative in protecting and improving soil health, and doing so with the anticipation of innovation in technologies and farming practices going forward. So we're anticipating a pretty smooth transition into our role as easement holders, and we look forward to welcoming the new landowners and continuing to build soil health on these properties. In the meantime, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about our role or our organization. Thanks.
Thank you, Carissa. Potential buyers should understand here too that White Rock is a local organization. These are people that are in our community. They're well known and they know the area. So you're not being monitored from afar. These are people that know the farms and want to work to adhere to the provisions that have been put in the conservation easement and improve soil health. So by and large, they're going to try to work with you to make these farms better, to help improve your farming, and to help these be profitable tracts for you to own. The last presentation of the day is going to be Liz Garst. Liz is the spokesperson for the Garst family. She's been surrounded by agriculture her entire life, growing up in her family's pioneering seed corn business and eventually leading the family's business and farming entities. Lives in Coon Rapids and has been a longtime advocate for protecting our most valuable resource, the land. She regularly speaks on the topics of soil health, carbon sequestration, and preparing for a changing climate. Liz and her family created the idea of the soil health easement, and she'll provide the background of why that's such an important part of this sale. If you haven't seen her video, please visit the auction site and click on the link. It does a great job to explain the ideas that went behind the creation of the easement. So Liz, please take it away.
Thank you, Chris. The land we're selling has been in our family a long time. The Audubon County farms have been in our family since the mid-50s. Roswell's, my grandfather's hobby, one of them was to fix up degraded farms, including these farms that we're selling now. He was into grading out ditches and seeding down waterways above all else. In the late 60s, this land, some of it transferred to my generation, my sisters and I, the current owners. And early on in our ownership, we installed very extensive terraces and contour buffers, which really helped control soil erosion. Several years ago, I went to Portugal on a vacation and drove a rental car from Lisbon to the Roman castles on the east edge of Portugal. We drove through 100 kilometers of land to get to the castles that had been built to protect the food supply of the Roman Empire. Only we didn't drive through any agriculture at all. We didn't see anything except rocks and rock thistles. There were no villages, there were no people. There was only the road to the tourist castle and nothing else. And that's because all the soil in eastern Portugal is gone. I really got religion then and saw our future unless we do something to protect our soil. Jerry Hatfield, the leading USDA soil scientist of Iowa, has projected there will be no topsoil in western Iowa in 35 years and no topsoil in north central Iowa in 80 to 100 years. And given the legacy of my family, we're determined to make sure that this soil does not wash away. And the three main things we're looking at to have soil not wash away are erosion control structures. That means terraces, waterways, contour strips, and headlands, and in one case, a riparian buffer. The second is no tillage, except for farm repair purposes. And the third provision is continuous living roots in the ground. That, of course, could mean a biomass field or a pasture or hay ground. But if you're doing row crops, that means adding cover crops to the mix. We're sure that these three measures combined have essentially eliminated almost all the erosion on our farms. Not all of it, but almost all of it. And my sisters and I, who own this land, have put a lot of heart into the management of this land for decades. And we don't want to see it lost. And that's why we're implementing this conservation easement. We do hope it's a model and that it is tried elsewhere as well, but we wanted to start on our land with its protection forever. Thank you, Chris.
All right, thank you, Liz. So we're going to get into the question portion of the presentation. And as we've marketed these properties, there's been some questions that have come up on a regular basis. And so I've just prepared a list here for myself to go through some of these questions and provide answers that'll maybe help clarify some of the points of the easement. Number one, Are there any restrictions to anhydrous application? Can it be knifed into the ground? There are no restrictions to anhydrous, and yes, it can be knifed in. Are there any restrictions to hog manure application? No, there are no restrictions, and that can also be knifed in. But the operator should pay attention to the language about soil compaction in the easement. Let's see, we talked about one animal unit. I think Paul has addressed that. That's been defined within the easement, and the reference is the Iowa DNR manure management plan form. Another question is, what happens if cover crops can't be planted in the fall? Owners and operators must communicate with the easement monitor, who's White Rock Conservancy. Of course, impossible weather conditions or other acts of God occurrences will be dealt with as practically as possible. But the expectation here is that cover crops will be planted, even up until the ground is frozen, and that they would germinate in the spring and have continuous living roots in the ground. What are the baselines that will be used to confirm compliance with the easement? Existing soil testing, which is available in the data room, with special attention to soil organic matter and soil aggregate water stability tests. Will provide baselines for the easements. And then to follow that up, are the baselines set at the inception of the policy, and will they stay into perpetuity? The long-term expectation is that cover crops and no-till farming practices will continually improve the soil health, and there's no need to change the original baseline. So the answer to the question is yes, the baselines are set. If the baselines are not achieved, if there's something going wrong and soil aggregate water stability is getting worse, there'll be a discussion between the owner operator and the easement monitor to determine the cause and the remedy. And then our baseline is currently being achieved on the property. Since there's no established standard like this anywhere else, the current baseline is the way the farm is right now. So as is conditioned, we assume that the baselines that are there will be what future owners are measured off of. So none of these farms are out of compliance with what's being written into the easement. Another question, is continuous corn allowed, or do the crops have to be rotated? Yes, continuous corn is allowed. If a farm is split, will a new conservation easement be created? The answer is yes. A new easement will be modified as necessary to update the legal descriptions, revise conservation structure language, clarify the owner of the building envelope, et cetera, et cetera. But there'll be some work to modify that to how the land is being split. Will the buyer be required to sign an easement document on the day of sale? The answer is no. The Garst family will sign the easement documents prior to the sale. And once that easement is recorded, it's binding upon future owners and runs with the land. So the easement will already be in place upon the day of sale. What is a building envelope? I know Paul addressed this, but just to reiterate, that's a 15-acre parcel of land on each one of these farms in which a structure or structures could be placed. Depending on the size of the tract and the farm size, there may be more than one building envelope available. Winning bidder will be required to choose the location of the building envelopes within 5 days of the auction. So if you have any more questions about that, please let us know. But can changes be made to existing tile and terraces? Yes. Requests for changes to erosion control structures should be submitted in writing to White Rock Conservancy, along with documentation of why the change is equivalent or better than what's already there. And that's kind of the measuring stick, is we want it to be as good or better than what's there. NRCS resources should be utilized. Our private consultants specializing in design and implementation of conservation features could also be consulted to provide some depth to the proposition of changing it. What is White Rock's process for handling requests? All communication will be handled by Carissa Shoemaker or Darwin Pierce. Maintenance issues, tile blowouts, erosion, and other items of that nature can be discussed and approved without going to the board of directors. However, a deviation from the easement language or a change to erosion control or other major changes that are proposed would require a written request and then action by the White Rock Board of Directors. So we've also received some questions here during the meeting. Again, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. First question here is, what if 3 people buy a parcel and split it and farm it as one, but each owns separate portions? Are they subject to 2 $20,000 costs for splitting? And I believe the answer to that question is yes, they would be responsible for that. There may be co-farming situations out there that we could address. We would just have to have those identified and put forward for discussion to see if that would be allowed by the easement. But again, if another owner has to be monitored and White Rock has additional duties in order to do that, it'd be subject to the $20,000 cost. What do you think, Paul?
I was going to say, if a number of people wanted to buy it in an LLC or as tenants in common, now we have to look to one set of owners that own the entire parcel. That does not strike me as an event that triggers this $20,000 fee. But if you really want to buy one parcel, 300 acres, 320 acres, but John's going to own 160 and Bill's going to own 160, at that moment we have to divide the easement, really record 2 separate easements with different Exhibit Bs, different terms, and that would trigger the $20,000 fee.
Okay. Next question. What if there's no CRP enrollment at the time of the contract expires? It happened in just the last few years. Can it be farmed while can the CRP be farmed while no enrollment is available to keep a crop history and eligibility? By the terms of the easement, no. CRP and grass and terraces, headlands, waterways are to remain as is. I imagine that would be something that we discussed with White Rock, but again, the way the easement is written, the crop acres are the crop acres, and grass and CRP will not be taken out.
Liz, I might want to just ask, isn't the Patrick farm in CRP, and aren't we anticipating that the owner has the buyer has the ability to take that out of CRP?
That's correct. The Patrick farm, which is the Guthrie County farm, is different than all the others in that it is in CRP now. And we have provided that if you want to take it out of CRP, you can. However, there would be substantial seeding costs to repay to 3 different organizations. And we have provided erosion control structures, theoretical, but that we would expect to be implemented as part of changing it back to row crop. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question asks about grazing of livestock. That will be subject to the density restriction of 1.5 animal units per acre per month. Livestock hasn't been grazed on these farms for years. So the fencing is what it is. It's in several cases, it's not necessarily suitable for livestock. It'd have to be repaired. Next question is, are Cafos allowed? Again, subject to the density requirements, but no, Cafos are not allowed because they would exceed the density requirements for livestock. Did you have something to add there, Liz?
I was just going to give an example if we're talking about a hog CAFO. Just for example, a 75-acre tract would be the same as 50 animal units, 50 cows, provided the DNR manure management materials indicate that 2.4 hogs equal 50 cows. So a 75-acre tract could have 120 hogs on it, just as an example. Thanks.
And And I think I'm doing the math right. If you only had the hogs there for a month, then it could be 12 times that amount because it's on an annualized basis. So if you had hogs there for a shorter period of time, you'd get to average it out over the course of the year.
What is the difference between tillage and fertilizer application, injecting P and K, injecting hog manure, or application of anhydrous ammonia? That's a good question. The difference, I believe, and I don't want to speak out of turn here, is the turning of the soil and the disruption of the entire farm. Typically, application of anhydrous ammonia or injecting hog manure is just a strip of the land, whereas full tillage obviously disturbs all the topsoil. The ground has to be broken to put in the crop, and we didn't want the conservation easement to be too restrictive here. So obviously application of fertilizer is allowed as well because it's minimal disruption. Will soil testing be required on a periodic basis? And is that by the landowners? The landowners will be asked to share their soil testing results. One of the monitoring procedures for White Rock will be to collect their own soil samples for the soil aggregate water stability test and other baseline information that they're trying to do. So the landowners will just be asked to share the results that they have. Typically that's on a 4-year rotation, or as recommended by your agronomist. Will the purchase agreement be available to review prior to the sealed bid deadline of August 6th? Yes, it will. In fact, we've all had a chance to review and comment on that document. Individualized purchase agreements are being prepared today, and I would expect them to be posted on the website this week for sure. On the outcome slides, are county yields the average for entire county on all county soils? County yield data was pulled from NASS, National Agricultural Statistics Service. So yes, I believe that would constitute the entire county average. Anything to add to that, David?
No, that's correct. That's correct.
Are the measures and data to support soil health, as mentioned, the baseline readings in the current soil test? Yes. So current soil testing data that's in the data room is going to serve as the baseline, with special attention to soil organic matter testing. And then all the farms have also had one round of soil or water stability testing as well. And that information will also become part of the easement and the baseline. I believe there'll be another round of soil aggregate water stability testing this fall. Is that right, Liz? I might have lost Liz.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Can volunteer trees and terraces, buffer strips, and fence lines be removed and controlled, not including the grove that's protected? Yes, junk trees, invasive trees, things that aren't supposed to be there can be removed. The grove on the large Ottoman farm is protected, as well as the riparian buffer area on the Nixon Reds farm. It's along the ditch. Anything else to add there, Liz?
No. No.
Okay. For cover crops, can the owner or tenant apply for cost share? Yes, I would believe that they could. Absolutely. There's this. The conservation easement is not an NRCS document, so you would be eligible for cost share, subject to their rules and conditions. White Rock mentioned experimentation. Is experimentation expected on these tracks? And if so, is it mutually agreeable and associated costs borne by White Rock? No, the easement doesn't require the owner to experiment or do anything outside of cover cropping and no-tilling. If the owner wanted to work with White Rock, of course, that'd be great. White Rock, is always researching new projects and trying to gather data on new farming techniques and practices, but certainly it's not required by the easement. As Paul mentioned in his presentation, the easement is written so that the new owner or operator can farm these tracts and be profitable in row crop farming. What type of soil testing will White Rock be using? What labs? There's a specific lab that White Rock has used for the soil aggregate water stability test. Do you recall the name of that, Liz?
I think it's Regen out of Nebraska.
Regen out of
It's a
Nebraska.
Midwest.
Okay. Otherwise, the operator or the owner can use the soil testing lab for traditional soil testing, P and K levels and organic matter. Whatever results you're normally using, I imagine would be acceptable. Do all cover crops have to be ground incorporated, or can they be aerial applied? The easement encourages ground incorporation. It has the highest and best success rate for germination and the best cover. But certainly, given the right conditions, aerial application is allowed as well. Do you have anything to add, Paul?
I was just going to read what it actually says on that. It says, until and unless best practices change and a deviation is agreed to by grantor and grantee in writing, there shall be a preference for drilling all cover crops, but aerial application shall be permitted if and when moisture conditions indicate a likelihood of success. And so I think if you wanted to do an aerial application, there'd probably be a discussion with White Rock, and we would reach consensus that it was responsible. And then down below it talks about, as best practices change, if there's data that develops that aerial is as efficacious as drilling, you would talk about it. And really White Rock's goal is just to make sure there's continuous living roots. So as long as you can show what you're doing is equally advancing that end, my anticipation is that they're going to embrace what you want to do.
Absolutely. As the easement was created and drafted, the discussion was that, farming practices are getting better all the time. There's more and more focus on protecting our land, about being more productive, about being more efficient. 10 years from now, farming could look very much different than what it does now. And the easement is written with the flexibility to allow change, to encourage improvements and things that makes these farms better and protect the soil health. Another question here. If you have high sealed bid on more than one tract and these weren't raised at the live auction, you actually want one tract over the other, are you stuck buying multiple tracts? Steve, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, the way we've set up the auction is that the high sealed bid will be the opening bid price at the auction. So if you have the high sealed bid, then if there was no additional raises at the auction, then you would be the winning bidder at that high sealed bid price. So, the top 7 bidders on each track are going to get invited back to the live auction, and you'll be able to bid on any tracks that you want if you're one of the top 7 bidders. But if you only want to end up with one of the tracks, then you need to bid accordingly, that you're aggressive on the one that you want and probably pull back on the one that is a secondary choice, knowing you can participate in the live auction on all of them.
All right, thank you. Can cattle manure from offsite be stockpiled in the summer to spread in the fall? As long as it's done according to NRCS DNR requirements. The answer to that is yes. As long as you're not breaking the DNR rules, containment of the manure, fencing of the manure, whatever provisions they would have in place. The answer to that is that would be allowed. Are there cover crop density requirements and seeding rates? Yes, those are referenced in the NRCS cover crop seeding and maintenance manual. Recommended seeding placement times and densities for different types of cover crops and seeding mixes. Are wind turbines encouraged or discouraged? Is the easement neutral? Compaction is discouraged. Wind turbines are certainly allowed, but within the building envelope. I don't think that White Rock or the Garst family takes a positive or negative viewpoint on the construction of wind turbines. If you wanted to purchase the tract and put one up, you certainly could.
I might add that the easement, in fact, when we talk about tillage, there's some language that specifically says if you need to bury infrastructure to service a wind turbine in a building envelope, that is permitted. And so there was care taken here to make sure that if there was a desire to have a wind turbine within the building envelope, you could do that. And I just want to, on the manure storage and stockpiling, I am not an expert at that, but if it involves structures, I think the structures probably, as drafted, have to go in the building envelope also.
Okay. Can the cover crops be harvested? Yes. There's no restriction on how you terminate the cover crop. That would probably default to your crop insurance provisions, guidance from NRCS. But certainly cover crops could be harvested, grazed, hayed, all the things that are allowed by crop insurance provisions. Will online bidding be available for the auction? The answer is yes. People's company is coordinating that. You want to add something to that, Steve?
Yeah, we'll make the link available on the auction website so folks can get registered for the online bidding ahead of the sale.
Okay.
But the sealed bid will not, that sealed bid portion will not be available online. You'll need to submit your written sealed bid, but the actual live bidding will be available online.
We've also had some questions about who will be allowed in on the day of auction. We'll ask that you bring a copy of the sealed bid or possibly a communication from People's Company or Community Insurance. The idea on the day of the live auction is to limit the number of people in the room. There'll be a lot of money exchanging hands that day, and I know buyers appreciate privacy and discretion in bidding. So we'll certainly do our best to control that environment. I believe that's all of the questions that we've got posted so far. Again, there's been a lot of information here. There's a lot of information on the website. Please feel free to submit questions to my email address or to Molly at peoplescompany.com. Anyone else like to add anything before we sign off here today?
Chris, you just got one more question.
Okay, thank you. Is live bidding online limited to people that are invited per the auction requirement? I would say yes. You would have to you'd have to be an approved bidder in order to get a link into the auction. So you'd have to have one of the 7 highest bids on one of the tracks in order to get into the auction. Is that how you see it happening, Steve?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
And we'll have to approve all bidders, so somebody can't sign up last minute and start bidding online. We'll have to approve those internally.
Very good. So, Our goal is to get as much information out there to you buyers as possible. I know that this is a new concept to buy a piece of land with a conservation easement on it. There's nothing to hide here. We want full disclosure on what's in the easement, how will it be monitored, and who will you be working with. These are all highly productive tracts that are going to be a good addition to a land portfolio in the future. So please research the easement. Please take the time to ask more questions, and please attend our future webinars here for additional training. We want to thank everyone that's been on the call today. We appreciate your time. I think it's been a really productive webinar.